Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. It is Monday, June 28th. I'm Rob Fowler. I'm the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan, and Brian Calley, president of SBAM, is the co-host. And as Brian mentioned at our last briefing, we have kind of a new sponsor, but really an old sponsor. Health Screen and Healthy Visitor was kind of a product of a company called Marana Group, and Marana Group is a data, document, and distribution solutions company. One of the things we learned during this pandemic was the importance of being able to get to your documents remotely, while still having access to all the documents you would have while you were on site. Marana Group offers document scanning and archiving, which allows you to move your current documents and legacy documents from the file cabinet to the cloud. You can find out more at maranagroup.com. Brian, I've been thinking a little bit today about where we were this time last year. The 4th of July was coming, seemed like it was nearly over. We were lifting restrictions, and if you remember, in northern Michigan and the UP, restaurant capacities were being lifted and some other things. It really looked like it was almost over. What a year since then, since this time last year.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that we'll dig into a little bit more today. What are the risks? As we were talking in the spring, especially as there was threats of additional, in that last wave, threats of additional restrictions, and we kept on saying we're heading toward a natural low point in the cycle anyway. Don't do more restrictions. The mistake last year was they kept restrictions on when the risks were very low. So by the time we got to the fall, when the risks were to get a little bit higher, or a lot higher, there was no resiliency built up from just being able to get back at it, both personally and economically, over the course of the summer. So this summer, thankfully, the restrictions have been lifted, and the numbers are very, very low. But as we look around the world, we see that the risks are not gone, and so there's a lot of things that I'm watching real closely around the world, and in addition to what's happening here in Michigan. But thankfully, in Michigan and indeed across most of the United States, the pandemic is in retreat.
Well, we're going to dig into that today, both it is Data Monday after all, so we'll take a look at the data, but some of the implications, like Michigan's economic recovery in context. And so we'll take a look at that. Let's start with the data, though. We've been saying that we're reaching now really all-time lows in a couple of categories. You want to take a quick look at what we're seeing?
So it's all good news in terms of our local outcomes. So the case numbers, as you see, the absolute case numbers getting down very, very low. As of late last week, you see that there was 40 cases reported, and that's even lower than June. Look at this last point here in June of last year, how low it got. So we're even lower than last June. So that's great news. Looking at deaths overall, we see those continue to fall. Not a surprise, cases go down. I think that we're getting pretty close to when we'll see this one go to a literal zero on certain days, where it won't be unusual for us to see zeros. Hospitalizations, you see those have come down quite a bit. Still hospitalizations, but very, very low, and I expect this will get even lower as well. I threw in here from Bridge Magazine this map of Michigan by county, and look at all this green. The green, 0 cases on that, reported on that particular day. So we're already getting to a point where even cases for some of our more rural counties are coming back in at low levels, and most of the rest in that light blue color is fewer than 10 cases. So again, good news. Looking around the United States of America, we've got, here's that kind of the biggest way that we came off. It went down and then continued to go down, and it's kind of leveled off now. So we're at this leveling off period, but I wanted to provide a little bit of context for that, because obviously it's a big country. It's got a lot of different regions, and here's our here are the states with the highest numbers around the country. So you'll see, U.S. Virgin Islands, the cases per 100,000. By the way, all of these are low, right? So, but these are the highest ones in the country, but relatively low compared to what we would have seen just a couple of months ago. But looking at the numbers, are they going up or are they going down? Well, Nevada is number one, the highest in the country, and so is Missouri, tied, but both going up at a rate, and that's a 14-day change. So as opposed to, these two are, pretty close to the same level, but going down. So pretty big difference. Utah and Arkansas both going up as well. Florida is pretty much leveled out, been one of the more aggressive reopening states, and has been pretty consistent throughout that this whole time. Looking at vaccination rates, I just pulled those that are below 40% and those states that are above 50%, and this is fully vaccinated, not just one shot. So as you look across this list, you will not see Michigan on there, because Michigan is literally the average. We are we go between 25th and 26th, and in terms of our rate. So Michigan is right in the middle, but looking across the, you'll see some crossover on in terms of where infections are going up and where you see lower numbers of vaccinated people. Obviously not a surprise there. But that's where the nation stands. The United States average is 46% fully vaccinated. Again, Michigan, that's not of people eligible, that's of total population. So you might hear that, we're 62% vaccinated, but that's talking about people eligible to receive the vaccination. Sometimes it's of adults, but this percentage here is of total population. And Michigan is at 46, just like the national average. So here's how it shapes up in terms of across the country. These are not Michigan numbers. These are US averages of all ages, 18 and up and 65 and up. So it's really good news that 65 and up is this high. Pretty good fidelity with second shots, which we're going to talk about that in a bit. That turns out is very important, as we can see from other countries and what they're experiencing right now. I wanted to pull out just a couple of other countries to look at around the world. If you look at the global numbers, you see those global numbers have come down pretty sharply, and that is because of India. Take a look at here. India's got very, very high very quickly, and then came down. We probably have no idea how high India actually got, because testing throughout the entire country is not like it is here, certainly not like it is in places like China. And so you never really know total cases, but it came down a lot, and that's driven the entire world numbers down. But Brazil continues to struggle in getting their numbers to come down. They've had kids out of school for so long in so many of these countries in South America that it will cause some issues for a very long time. But here's the one, Rob, if there's one I'm most worried about, it's this one. And that is the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, take a look at the way their numbers have started to rise. I told you a couple of weeks ago that this is one that I was going to watch pretty closely, because the UK actually was scheduled to remove the rest of their restrictions on their economy, and they delayed that for 4 weeks. And whether or not they will delay it again or add additional restrictions, kind of an open question. But as we see the numbers start to rise in the UK, there is a pretty key difference between the UK and in the US. The UK, during this time period here, their situation was really very dire. They decided to go with a first dose strategy with a 12-week waiting period between doses. So the number of people fully vaccinated is not as high as many places in the US. And so I think that provides us a little additional protection. But this is that newest, most famous variant that they call Delta, which comprises the vast majority of the new cases in the UK and in fact the places around the world that are struggling the most right now. So the reason I share that is, we've talked about this, the data, sharing the data as kind of being a forecast of what our future could hold. And so as we look at the differences in all these places, one thing that we know is that vaccination rates in most places are lower than the United States. The United States is one of the highest in the world. So that provides some protection. But when I look and see that the UK finds themselves on the wrong side of another wave, it sends, and then also some other countries that we can talk about as well. It gives me some concern that if vaccination rates in big sections of our country do remain below 40%, then or never make it to that point, like Israel is at a point where they're where they've reached, between natural immunity and vaccinations, have reached something that looks an awful lot like herd immunity. If we never reach that point, then we could find ourselves back in a position where our businesses are facing restrictions, and that's obviously the last thing that we want. Something that we would we know so much more about it that we would work hard against additional operational restrictions to businesses. But nevertheless, when we see this kind of context building around the world, I don't want us to become complacent as though we think, well, it's done and we're past it. When we look around the world, and there are places like Australia, and in fact even Israel and the UK, that are moving backward in terms of those restrictions.
Yeah, I think there's the obviously there's the issue of personal freedom, and people have a right to decide about their own vaccination. But I do think it's interesting that we have a stake in getting to herd immunity one way or another. It really is in the best interest of small business for us to achieve that. It's interesting to watch what some other states and countries are doing. Obviously, I love the fact that you're staying on top of that, because I do think it's and again, as we look back to this time last year, we thought it was over. We thought it was, or the trend was going to just continue down, and we've been saying for some time the fall will be the game changers, vaccinations, but it's likely without that we'd be looking at another wave sometime this fall.
Yeah, and just to give you a few examples of what's going on around the world, in Australia, where they've been pretty aggressive but have remarkably low vaccination rates, they're doing in some regions of that country like true lockdowns, like March of 2020, what we had April and March of 2020. They're doing that now in Australia. Now, keep in mind, they're in their winter, right? Our summer is their winter. The other is Israel went back to indoor mask mandates. So they had gone away from that. They've now gone back to it. And it's now their numbers are still really, really low. So I guess you could call that an extra conservative approach toward mitigation of spread. But they're quite concerned about this new variant, and they just don't want to let it take hold. And then, of course, in Great Britain, where they've delayed lifting the final restrictions, and now they're kind of in a vaccination race to get those second shots, to get as many people and so that they can get back to normal sooner.
All right. Actually, I just wanted to kind of circle back. You had Sean Egan from the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity on the briefing last Thursday. And it's just to review kind of the state of things, the current state. We are now in a place where there are no epidemic emergency orders, no executive orders in place that affect small businesses, at least. And we're kind of in a phase where we are no longer under requirements for businesses, but recommendations. that a fair statement? And what does that mean for small businesses?
When we had Sean on, I knew that he wouldn't be able to give us a kind of black and white answer of, well, okay, now that these restrictions are gone, what if a complaint comes in? How will this be looked at? How will it be judged, and how will the investigation go if an employee complains to MyOSHA? Because we know that complaints will still come in, and so the feedback that we got was that while there weren't any rules, that doesn't mean nothing. And in terms of there's still some risk, and employers are expected to take mitigation against any risks that could affect your employees in the workplace, and so any recognized risk. And at this point, you can't say that COVID-19 isn't recognized. So so in practice, we really have to kind of zero in on what does that mean. And I thought maybe a good way to illustrate this would be to talk about what we're doing at SBAM. So there are a lot of things that have gone from requirements now to just recommendations. And so, as an example, there's no longer a mask requirement, and so we don't have a mask requirement in our offices, but we still have a recommendation that people who are unvaccinated mask. And so the idea of following the lead of the agencies, because what they went from taking away a rule and making it just a recommendation. So we've just followed suit. If they were to then come back and say, knock on our door and say, hey, we got an employee complaint, we would then show them, hey, look, our practices match your recommendations. And in many cases, that means that the mitigation that was required before is now recommended. And then on the kind of the soft skill side of things, we do have an expectation that that everybody who works and interacts with SBAM will be respectful of where another person is on their journey back to normal. Some people are ready to move faster. Some people want to move slower, and we do have to respect that. And so we've got a great culture in our organization. It's been built over decades. And so I'm not concerned at all about that, but it's something that we want to be very intentional about, that there are some mitigation steps that certain employees would like to take, and that's great. That can help them to transition back to something that looks more like a regular workflow, in-person type workflow. And then there are others that are, just long since ready to jump back in and go after it. So just as an example, in most cases, it's difficult for me to imagine many scenarios where in any event that an employer is penalized for not following rules that no longer exist. But going from having a COVID-19 response and preparedness plan with all these different elements to just nothing, in a lot of cases, just for the sake of your employees and their comfort level and kind of ramping in, we see a pretty good alignment between what's good for our organization and just maintaining recommendations as per CDC and MyOSHA.
And maybe just to add a little to that, I mean, part of what we'll continue to do is recommend social distancing, just for people to be aware of it and conscious of it. We'll recommend limits on our boardroom, our conference room, our copy room, and those sort of things, just to continue to sort of keep this in the consciousness. Things that have always been there: if you're sick, don't come to work. Wash your hands. I think we should get one of those signs that's at restaurants: all employees must wash their hands before returning to work. That just seems like a good idea no matter what. So.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff is common sense, and there's no harm in writing down common sense, so that if a regulator or a complaint came in and a regulator knocked on your door, you could show the common sense practices that that you follow. And just something like, hey, if you are sick, don't come into work. That's the sort of thing where it's a common courtesy, really, to your employee, to your coworkers. And we also have a remote and hybrid work policy in place as well, that there will be more in-person work going forward, but that does not mean at SBAM, but that does not mean return to pre-COVID practices. We've actually, in a lot of ways, learned how to operate even better than before, and so we have that remote work policy in place. So I feel very, very confident that our organization will be ready to answer anybody's inquiries about what are you doing, without it being kind of the prescriptive and rigid requirements of workplace safety rules.
So all of this sort of leads us to, a couple of rankings came out earlier this week, or maybe last week, I guess, about just economic recovery. How are we doing from a recovery standpoint? There's an organization called Wallet Hub that released a set of rankings about states recovering the quickest, and also the inverse of that is the slowest. How did Michigan rank in this Wallet Hub ranking?
Yeah, so Wallet Hub is it's a digital or online financial services company, and they are involved in a lot of things. And so they had a bunch of metrics that they brought in, dozens of metrics that they brought in, that they felt impacted how Michigan was, or how all states were doing relative to other states. And they put as number one on their list in terms of the economic recovery, South Dakota. And they put number 50 on their list, or actually 51 on their list, because it included the District of Columbia, Michigan. And so people can argue all day long about which factors and what's the most important, and did they weight everything correctly. But in a lot of ways, we're starting later. And I think that's what in terms of just the full-on economic activity to put that engine back in place, and in a lot of important categories, we just started later. And so we're behind in other places in terms of the overall recovery. And that ranking showed that. And it generally showed that the states that were more aggressive toward economic freedom and reopening, and people taking more personal responsibility for their pandemic management, in pandemic protection, did better than the states that held back more. So it's not to say Michigan can't recover. We will, and we are. In fact, we see some other measures where things are starting to take off here in Michigan, and I expect that will really continue as we get further and further from the date at which the final restrictions were lifted.
We were, if not the last, to lift capacity restrictions, among the very last states to do that. And as you said, we always knew that had economic consequences, and that's just a very tangible example of it. Actually, another one that came up last week was the GDP of the states and states' recovery. It actually looked like good news, although in context, I think it's sometimes you look good when you're moving fast from the back of the pack.
Yeah, and that's where Michigan stands now with our GDP. So the GDP numbers came out last week, and so if you look at the quarters, just this last quarter, Michigan was above the national average and highest GDP growth in the Midwest, and that's great. Of course, there's good news. There's no downside to that. But the context, I think, is important, that if you were to look back over go back all the way to the first quarter of 2020. So if you look at that quarter, or all four quarters of last year, and then the first quarter of this year, in addition to the second quarter of 2021, what you find is that we were last in the Midwest and behind and below the national average 4 out of the last 5 quarters. So our base had been diminished more. And when it kind of was eroded and relatively weak compared to our neighbors, when things finally did start to take off here in Michigan, when there were a couple of big stages where restrictions were taken off and people could just move forward, you did see a lot of economic growth that came out of that. And so we had our comeback had started later. It was measured against a smaller and more diminished base, and so that percentage increase is big. And so what does that mean? It means it's the first step in catching up. And so on the one hand, it's hard. It's kind of hard to. Sometimes when you're number one, it's not for all good reasons, but there's no downside to it, right? So we're number one because our base was diminished more than most, but we're also number one because we're starting to that long process of catching up and making back that which was lost.
We were talking before we started the briefing today about, just in the days of clickbait and sensational headlines trying to get you to, to open the article. Sometimes, the Michigan is first in economic recovery kind of headline doesn't tell the whole story. Here's another one that doesn't tell the whole story. We have been following this issue of a tax credit, sales and use tax credit, for the purchase of PPE equipment, and then the governor vetoed that. That's a head scratcher at first, but there is probably more to that story than just the governor doesn't want to help small business.
Yeah, this one actually was driven mostly by, I think, mostly by Democrats in the legislative process. It was a little bit surprising when that one came back vetoed, but the concept was, look, the government said businesses, you must buy these things and implement these practices, but those things that you pay sales and use tax on some of them, and so the concept behind the bill was give a credit for any sales and use tax paid on personal protective equipment for the pandemic. And that seems like inherently fair, right? So if the government is going to say you have to do these things, then the least the government can do is not charge you taxes on those things that they say you have to do. And there was good, broad bipartisan support for it. The governor vetoed it, and in the veto it said, well, we support the idea of giving of covering this cost of taxes, but not as a tax credit. It would need to be a grant. Now the reason behind that is because she would prefer to use the American Recovery or American Rescue Plan money from the federal government, and that in that law they say you cannot use it for tax credits or tax cuts. And so technically, this is a reimbursement to businesses. But what the governor's office was saying is, look, we could do this, but it had to be a grant, not a tax credit. Otherwise, we can't use ARP money from the federal government. I get that, and that is probably true that you can't use that money. I'm not an expert on what types of credits you can and can't do with the American Rescue Plan money. But I do know that state government resources, state government revenue has gone way, way up. So just in the month of May, it came in $1 billion higher than what they anticipated. So the state could have done this and used excess state cash in order to cover the cost of this tax credit, which would have been a short-term issue. It's not something that's going to continue on into the future. And so that would have, I think, I don't understand really the need to have it vetoed. The grants it's the most inefficient way to get money out. The most efficient way is a tax credit, because when you're filing you have to file a return anyway. This is just an item on that return to file for a credit. So it's no real extra work for government. It's no real extra work for the business. But to do as a grant, we've got a lot of experience with grants over the last couple of years, and last year and a half anyway. And grants are a real pain to administer, and they're a real pain to apply for. And so disappointing. I don't know if the issue is dead or not. It might come back up, but disappointed.
The vote on that was unanimous in the Senate, and over 100 votes in the House both sides of the aisle. So that really was surprising. And I think it speaks to maybe the lack of communication between the legislative process and the governor's office. That probably could have been avoided. Hey, one last thing. I think one of the groups of small businesses that got overlooked early on in the pandemic were theaters and live music venues, and some of those who were just literally shut down. There was just complete closure. And along came something called the Shuttered Venues grant program, and it really seems like a lifeline for some of those companies. And money must just be pouring into those companies right now, because the government passed this bill and it's in effect, right?
Yeah, right. Except for they have not distributed any of it yet. And this is when you hear us talk about how much we like the Paycheck Protection Program because they worked through banks and credit unions, the money got out. May not have been smooth or bumps along the way, but it's better than having the Small Business Administration, not us, we're the Small Business Association, but better than having the Small Business Administration administer it themselves, because $15 billion was set aside to help with shuttered venues who the Paycheck Protection Program frankly didn't work very well for. That money was set aside. It was going to make a massive, massive difference. And here we are halfway through the year. This was from 6 months ago. Still, not a single dollar has been distributed in it. And as these venues are trying to get up and running, it takes capital to get up and running. I was in the hopes that the Shuttered Venues grant would really give these venues the capital they needed to get things started again. And still, not only have they not given out any money, my understanding is they have not even acknowledged receipt of applications. They haven't done any approvals. They haven't done anything. We've got your application. It's complete. We're just waiting for whatever. Nothing. Crickets.
That is a head scratcher. And on that note, we're going to wrap it up today. Thanks for joining us. As always, we'll be back Thursday at 3 o'clock. We appreciate you spending this time with us. Happy to hear any questions that you have. You can send those to sbam@sbam.org. We'll see you around on Thursday.
See you on Thursday, everybody. Thanks for joining us.